field. He's also famous in politics, although this is not his field. Also in this field, he wrote many books and many articles in both fields, and he is famous in both fields in the same way. He wrote, as I said, many books, and some of these books were translated to Arabic. His lecture will be on the subject national sovereignty and democracy in the third world, and in the name of the university and the program of international studies and Muwatin, I welcome him, and please.
See. Can you hear me? Is this all right? Yeah? Okay?
Just raise your voice.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Get closer, yeah. Well, I'm doubly pleased to be here, first because I'm pleased to be here, and second because last time I wanted to speak here, as you just heard. The talk had to be switched to East Jerusalem. If we tried to do it now, we couldn't do it in East Jerusalem. So let's hope that the next time it'll be free to be anywhere. Just before the Oslo Accords, I happened to come across some remarks by Haider Abdel Shafi in a talk that he gave in Bethlehem in July 1993. That was at the time when the PLO leadership was secretly taking matters into its own hands and bypassing the Palestinian negotiators. Dr. Abdel Shafi in this talk held out a very little hope for the peace process, as it's called, which he said was structured in such a way that it could not lead to real self-determination. These are conclusions that he repeated, as you know, after the Declaration of Principles was announced a few weeks later, and as the next stages were underway. The basic problem that he discussed in this July 1993 talk, which became still sharper when the PLO leadership took over, the basic problem was that the negotiations were taking place between a rich, powerful, well-organized state that was virtually an accessory of the superpower in charge, and on the other hand, representatives of a society that had been scattered, oppressed, and lacked internal cohesion, democratic institutions, and a representative leadership. And in such a confrontation, the outcome is predictable, he pointed out, and also the path toward improving these conditions to allow more meaningful negotiations is also clear from that analysis. Let me quote his own words. In the July talk, he said, "The negotiations are not worth fighting about. The critical issue is transforming our own society. We must decide amongst ourselves to use all our strengths and resources to develop our collective leadership and the democratic institutions that will achieve our goals and guide us for the future. The important thing for us is to take care of our own internal situation and to organize our own society and conduct correct these negotiations from the negative aspects from which our society has been suffering for generations, and which is the main reason for our losses against our foes." These remarks struck me as perceptive and accurate when I read them in August 1993, even more so when the Oslo Accords were announced a few weeks later, and as events developed on what seemed to me a predictable and ominous path. More recently, Azmi Bishara has stressed the fact that only, I'm quoting him, only democracy can save the Palestinian administration from Lahadism, while absence of democracy will turn its Bantustan situation into the final status. That conclusion also seems to me plausible and accurate. In the absence of democracy, Azmi went on, popular mobilization will be deflected into a catastrophic confrontation with the Palestinian Authority instead of Israel, which seems to me largely correct. I would only like to add that to be a success, the confrontation will have to cut across Israeli-Palestinian society to join elements in both societies, and it will also have to rely on a form of international solidarity among peoples abroad, particularly in the United States, which is overwhelmingly dominant in this region and indeed much of the world. These are dimensions of the problem that I think have not been properly faced in the past, and that reflect the internal problems of Palestinian society to which Dr. Abdel Shafi has focused attention. One aspect of these problems is the isolation of leadership from a healthy democratic interchange that might have helped to correct a seriously mistaken course, in my opinion. The internal problems of democratization involve dismantling of authoritarian and repressive institutions, ranging from the family to the larger society. That's a prerequisite for the developing of effective policies and constructing a public stance that might yield a favorable outcome despite extraordinarily difficult circumstances. It's a problem that has taken place, sometimes in ways that are quite remarkable and inspiring. Under conditions of terrible oppression and poverty, some of which I've witnessed myself firsthand, under such conditions people have sometimes, in some fashion, remarkable fashion, found the inner resources to create vibrant, lively civil societies and to open a democratic space. That's been true of the Palestinians as well, dramatically so during the Intifada. I had a chance to see a little bit of this myself traveling through the West Bank with Azmi in 1988. Of the issues that I know something about, in part from direct experience over quite a few years, I want to talk about two questions, two rather simple matters. One is the question of international solidarity, and the second is the matter of confronting illusions and failures. Both of these relate closely to the issue of internal democratization. The creation of healthy democratic institutions that really function, an open space for free discussion and interchange, and a representative leadership that grows out of that background and constantly returns to it. Those are factors crucially involved in these two issues that I want to discuss, and it should hardly require emphasis that for the people who are suffering the most, relations with an international community and a clear-headed understanding without illusions are matters of essential importance. Liberation requires limits on the power of the oppressor from within. Otherwise, there will be no liberation. Again, I think that's true from personal relations to large-scale political and social struggles. I think that history shows that quite clearly. Direct experience confirms it, often richly, and again, I stress that's true of every relationship, from interpersonal to social political struggle of a broader type. In the specific case of national liberation, this translates into the need to construct bonds of sympathy and support with people inside the system of power that is holding the guns. That can be done. I could add just personally that some of the most treasured moments of my own life involve participating in relations of just that kind within the United States and in many parts of the world. For the Palestinians, what this means is relations within Israel and within the United States. One of the great failures of the Palestinian leadership, in my personal opinion, is that it has not undertaken these efforts as it might have, and in fact it has even erected barriers to establishment of such relations. And the costs in suffering and anguish have been great. The lack of roots in a society with internal democracy has very likely been a factor. There are many illustrations of the crucial significance of international solidarity, of links between those who are struggling against oppression and popular forces elsewhere, crucially within the powerful systems that are conducting the oppression themselves. So take, say, the United States wars in Indochina. There's no question whatsoever that the United States government could easily have smashed the resistance in Indochina at very little cost to itself, simply by declaring a World War II-style mobilization, national mobilization, and unleashing its full resources of violence. Unsophisticated to recognize it, but it is a fact. The same was true of the U.S. wars in Central America in the 1980s, the U.S. war against Cuba for 35 years. Again, all of those wars could easily be won if it were not for the internal impediments, the internal barriers to using the force that is more than available. To take a case that really is relevant closely here, South African white society had more than enough force at its command to destroy the African National Congress and to maintain the apartheid system and the Bantustans. Internal opposition within the white society and strong international solidarity movements limited those measures, and after enormous suffering, the system was finally overthrown. It's well to remember that the dramatic collapse of the apartheid system, and of course the dismantling of the homelands, which is very recent, was also very surprising. No one could have predicted that a few years ago. The repression was reaching a peak just a few years ago. In fact, in the early 1990s was probably the time of greatest atrocities. 10 years ago, there was a virtual war against the African population, and the African National Congress was barely able to survive it. But it changed, and it's an indication of what can happen with dedicated and courageous struggle, in this case crucially dependent on very powerful bonds of sympathy and support within the oppressive society and in the outside world. And there are many other examples. In fact, I don't know of a successful liberation struggle that doesn't have this characteristic. These examples show, I think, that injustice will not be overcome without dedicated and courageous struggle by the victims, but that more is needed if concentrations of power are not to prevail. Those concentrations of power must be restricted and eroded, and that can only come about from within, and that will come from links of sympathy and support for struggles against injustice. Another crucial element of liberation is a willingness to free oneself from illusions. That's never easy, and in societies that are less free, it can be extremely difficult. A leadership that is isolated from democratic and popular interactions is more likely to act on the basis of illusion and misunderstanding, for reasons that are clear and I think are well demonstrated by the historical record. It's particularly difficult and important to face failures honestly and to ask why they occurred. The Palestinian national movement has achieved a great deal in the face of extremely powerful enemies and enormous obstacles, but there have also been serious failures, and I think Dr. Abdel Shafi identified their roots accurately. Specifically, the PLO leadership over the years failed to comprehend how the more democratic societies function, and I think Palestinians have suffered gravely from these failures and should think about them quite seriously. Among the cases that I know anything about myself from study or from direct participation, and there are many, among those the PLO is unusual and perhaps unique in its failure to make any serious effort to reach public opinion in the United States or even to understand the importance of doing so. The guiding idea seemed to be that politics is a matter of deals that are made in secret among elites, which is true in part, but only in part. Popular sentiments and actions play a very significant role, and the PLO leadership never seems to have recognized that. It is unnecessary to stress that the United States is of overwhelming significance in this regard. It basically has run this region for 50 years, and even more so in the last few years. And the Middle East region is of central importance in U.S. strategic planning, not because of Israel and the Palestinians, but because of the oil resources. So not to pay attention to what's happening in the United States is it's just an invitation to disaster and defeat. In the United States, in my opinion, the PLO would have found it much easier to present its case than many other third world movements. And it also had unparalleled resources, maybe too much for its own good, I suspect. I'm not joking about that. The Palestinian cause could have gained a great deal of popular support. Just to illustrate with a crucial part of the story, for more than 20 years, the United States government has unilaterally blocked diplomatic efforts to implement a very broad international consensus in favor of a two-state settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Meanwhile, the population in the United States favored that outcome by about 2 to 1. And that's a remarkable figure because few people had even heard any public advocacy of this position, meaning they made it up for themselves. And virtually no one was aware of the role of their own government in blocking the path to a peaceful settlement. No significant solidarity movement developed, despite the efforts of many activists within the United States. Even the most elementary facts could not break through to public attention and awareness. This is quite different from the cases that I mentioned before and others like them. Well, there are many reasons for these very painful failures, and all of us have to think about our own role in those failures. But one reason lies in choices that were made by the PLO leadership. These are matters, again, that I think that Palestinians should consider quite carefully. Edward Said has recently begun to discuss some of the efforts that he had undertaken to try to convince the PLO leadership, quote him now, this is his phrase, to organize a strategic campaign abroad to articulate the moral dimensions of the cause rather than posturing as romantic militants. He has brought up the anti-apartheid campaign as a model that could have been followed, and in fact was proposed as a model to be followed, but was not followed. It is an appropriate analogy, even more so now that we see the outcome, one of many. Actually, I was personally involved in some of these efforts for many years, and the failure was total, beyond anything I know of. And I think that significant opportunities were lost. I don't think that's forever. I think it can be overcome, but only if the issues are faced squarely, honestly, and without illusion. The facts about these matters have never really been made public for all sorts of reasons, but it isn't hard to discover them. Well, let me turn to some illusions that have seriously undermined the Palestinian cause. There are many such. These include misunderstandings of issues of solidarity and democratic politics, about armed struggle, terror, the role of the Soviet Union, Palestinian armed strength in Lebanon, world order and its rules, and many others. I'm just mentioning examples I know of from personal experience. More recently, there are, I think, quite serious illusions about the Oslo process. Again, a lot of these illusions have, I think, been serious and have caused a great deal of harm. A more democratic community could have provided a corrective and still can. Let me take one current example to illustrate. This one from a meeting of the non-aligned movement in New Delhi just a few weeks ago. Farouk Kaddoumi attended as a representative of the Palestinians. And an interview with Kaddoumi was published in a very good Indian journal. Here are a few of his statements I'm quoting. Statement 1, peace for land is the basis of the Oslo peace agreement, and Israel had given a commitment to withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories, but this process has collapsed because Netanyahu was against the peace process from the beginning, although I feel, Kaddoumi continues, that there is still hope for the peace process to be resurrected. 2, under the Oslo agreements, Palestinians were supposed to have control over water, telecommunications, and transportation, among other things. 3, in the Oslo process, the PLO insisted on sticking to the text of the initiative made by former U.S. President George Bush, which involved the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions on Palestine. This would have solved the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. 4, Israel gave guarantees at Oslo regarding Jerusalem, although they were secret, but current efforts to Judaize Jerusalem violate these guarantees. Those are the basic statements. That picture is completely wrong from start to finish. It has no resemblance to the truth. Let me go through it case by case. Take the notion of peace for land and Oslo. The Declaration of Principles, didn't say much, but it did lay out the basic framework, and its crucial part, the only part that was definite, was what it said about the permanent settlement, that is, the long-term settlement to be reached down the road. It said that it would be based on UN 242, crucially excluding other UN declarations on Palestinian rights. Now, you know very well that there's been a long debate about this for many years. The UN 242 is completely rejectionist. It says nothing about Palestinian rights. It talks about Palestinians as having it says a just solution to the refugee problem. That's the only reference to Palestinians. So UN 242 is a totally rejectionist agreement, nothing about Palestinians. From the mid-70s, lots of other declarations came along about Palestinians.
I'm Mark Brzezinski, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.